Good afternoon. We're here at the Bermuda Tech Summit, a virtual event for 2020. I'm Dennis Pitcher, the Chief Fintech Advisor to the Premier of Bermuda, and I'm very pleased to be joined by Sheila Warren, the Head of Blockchain, Data, and Digital Assets at the World Economic Forum. Thank you, Sheila, for joining me.
Thanks, Dennis, for having me. Glad to be here.
So just to start off, I think though the World Economic Forum is a broad and well-known organization, I'd like to hear a little bit more about what your experience is or where your focus is with blockchain particularly and where the organization sees the opportunities.
Thanks for asking. So we certainly have been bullish on the technology for quite some time here. I think that we recognized very early on in sort of the 2016s and 17s, there was a lot of hype, but we also saw that underlying that hype, there was a core that was quite powerful and was really going to revolutionize, in our view, financial and other systems. And so in the fintech space, around that orientation, we're very focused on digital currency, CBDC, central bank digital currencies, stablecoin, and of course, cryptocurrencies, and what those different opportunities might actually present in terms of financial inclusion and really more equitable access to the world's financial systems.
So those topics have really grown in prominence since you really started this in 2016 and 2017. Do you find there's a lot of interest? There's a lot of people looking to the World Economic Forum for guidance on the direction and what they should be doing?
You know, I think that what makes us unique is that in typical forum fashion, we do bring together a multi-stakeholder and global group of individuals to talk about this. So we've got private enterprise and companies and governments, civil society, a lot of different kinds of actors, international organizations. And what we try to do is make sure that we have a global perspective. So we're not just looking at what the G7 or G20 are doing. We're looking for innovation that's happening all around the world to ensure that all the opportunities that are being explored really are getting global attention, quite frankly. In this particular space, I think around currency, what we're seeing is a lot of the innovation is happening quietly. You know, there was a time here, I think, I'd say until quite recently, actually, where many different governments or others really were pretty hesitant to own the level to which they were engaging in exploration in this area and in blockchain more broadly, but particularly in the fintech space. And I'm really happy to see that some of the caution around that has been removed. And I think that we've played a role in bringing this to light and making it very clear that this mechanism or this mode of financial engagement is going to be something that we expect to see more and more around the entire world.
What is some of the interest in buy-in that you're seeing at the country level at this point, particularly around digital currencies?
Yeah, so, you know, we started off our work in this space really with bringing together central bank technologists. And we tried to ensure that the technologists were speaking to people who were deep technical experts from the startups and from the academic sphere. So to make sure that the technical possibilities here and what this technology was going to unlock in terms of possibilities, whether that's UX, whether that's payment rails, whatever it might be, that we were all really getting to a common understanding about that. And as a result of that work, we actually released this last year in Davos at our annual meeting, or I guess this year in 2020 in Davos, feels like a lifetime ago, doesn't it? Our central bank policymakers toolkit. And what that really is focusing on is central bank digital currencies and thinking about what is the option space there and how do you think about whether or not to launch one of these things? Like, do we need a CBDC? If so, why? How do we evaluate whether or not it's going to make sense for our citizens, for our economy? And so what we've seen is in the months following the release of that toolkit is a tremendous amount of interest and uptake in it, which to us indicates just how far and wide the investigation of CBDCs is actually happening. And certainly we've seen some of the major players in the space, whether it's the BIS or the World Bank or others, really spend quite a bit of time and attention on this notion of central bank digital currency and what it might provide and how it might amplify or augment in certain ways, you know, the availability of certain kinds of fiat-backed currency, but also how it might solve potentially problems around things like inclusion or access.
What is the motivation in terms of what this technology can do over traditional technology? One of the big pushbacks I get from people is, well, I can already send bank transfers electronically. There already exists digital money. How is this different? Why is this different?
Yeah, I think that actually the reason the world is maybe ready for these digital currencies is simply because the UX, right, the experience really would not be that different. So when the average person is asking, well, how will this look different? Oftentimes my answer is it won't look different. It may not even feel different. Right now you go into your mobile and you kind of send money to your friend for the drinks you bought or the whatever it might be, the kind of thing. It isn't really going to feel different because we're psychologically ready for this. What's different is really some of the back end, and not just the infrastructure, but some of the way that the currency that it actually moves from place to place. So it's elimination of some of the intermediary steps that need to happen, right? So right now, let's kind of think about this. If you and I were to, go out to dinner, let's assume we're in a post-COVID time, we'll go to dinner, and I want to pay you for my share of the dinner. We pull out our mobiles and I send something to you through whatever intermediary payment service I want to use. Is it a Venmo or a PayPal or whatever it might be, right? What's really happening there is that my bank is talking through to Venmo to your bank. Like, we're having these financial institutions that are actually engaging. They're debiting and crediting accordingly the amount of money that we're exchanging. But for our experience, we kind of hit some buttons and we walk away. And we have security that transaction was completed and we don't really think about it very much. We're placing our trust in those financial institutions. And in many parts of the world, that makes a lot of sense. But there's a fee extracted for that, and that can add up quickly. And in some parts of the world, you really can't place that kind of trust in some of these systems. So what a blockchain enables you to do is eliminate all that middle stuff. This is being very simplistic. And we can just almost directly, basically, exchange that value. We can exchange that store of value directly without the need for the record keeping function that these other institutions are playing invisibly in the background. So that's a difference that may not seem particularly profound to you and I as, somewhat sophisticated users of these technologies, or those who really engage a lot with e-money or digital money or these digital payments. But what it really means is that you are rethinking and really, in some ways, potentially revolutionizing that back-end system. And when you think about the gatekeeping that happens from some of these institutions, then it quickly becomes a very profound concept.
Is that still something that needs a blockchain? I mean, a blockchain being an open and shared platform, I think there's a lot of experimentation and there's a lot of looking at, do you do a closed system to drive quick efficiency? Is the technology going to evolve fast enough? What's really the advantage of saying a blockchain over just a traditional technology implementation of some of the same concepts?
So our view is that a blockchain, you might need a blockchain, you might not need a blockchain. A blockchain might add value, it might not add value. I think that there tends to be a lot of dogma from the technology space, from the blockchain ecosystem, that the only way, this is the only way to do it. It's really, really important that it only be this way. And we kind of go back to basics and say, well, it depends what problem you're trying to solve. And you can't have you can't assume the technology and then build a solution around it. You have to kind of say, what problem am I actually looking at? What is the thing here that is either not working or that could be better, more efficient, whatever it might be? And is a blockchain actually going to help that? And in some cases, the answer is going to be yes, but in many cases, the answer is maybe. And in some cases, the answer is really no. So you have to really be exploring and pushing on. This is very context dependent, right? So one of the reasons we rolled out this CBDC policymakers toolkit is because we had the, I don't think it's that radical, but seemingly radical notion that there is not a one size fits all answer. It's not that every economy should immediately roll out a CBDC. It's that every economy should be exploring this as something that might be fit for purpose, that might make sense. And certainly we think that every central bank should be very intimately aware of this technology, the fact that it exists, but it's getting rapid adoption in certain spheres in some parts of the world. But the decision about whether or not to use a blockchain in your technical solution is one that is quite specific to the context. And it really, you have to kind of almost do an ROI assessment. Look, how good is your legacy infrastructure? If you're going to overhaul the whole thing anyway, maybe you put a blockchain into your back end, into your stack, so that you have, it opens up other options down the line. But to answer your question more directly, one of the main advantages that people constantly cite is the ability to have programmable money. And that's pretty exciting potentially. But again, is it something that you need or don't? It just depends on what it is you're trying to accomplish. But if programmable money is something that you're really excited about, then generally speaking, a blockchain tends to be a solution that is going to be more likely to move you further in that direction than other solutions that exist. You got to really look.
Are there or parallels to the introduction and growth of blockchains to the early growth of the internet? I mean, when I look at the internet, I see a lot of the same characteristics of decentralization. Even payments, when I talk to someone, blockchain payments seem very, very risky in comparison to traditional payments. But the argument I make is I walk into a shop, if that payment runs over the internet, it's running over a very similar structure of unknown parties in many cases. I can't validate everyone who's on that system, but it drives a lot more interconnectivity. And that's where I'm curious, is there a lot of benefit to saying, yes, if you looked at the internet in 1995, there wasn't much to connect in and look at. But today, everything's connected. My phone's connected, my computer's connected, my watch is connected to the internet, to be honest. It makes sense, but if I had told people I wanted to connect my watch to the internet in 1995, I think there would have been a lot of people saying I'm crazy. Is blockchain a bit similar, or am I a little bit off?
Yeah, so I think it is, and I think it is similar in one. This is kind of how I talk about endgame, right? So people are like, well, how do we know when blockchain is really real versus not? I said, well, we're going to really know when we're not talking about it anymore. Like, no one really talks about the internet anymore. You talk about the apps you use. You want to talk about that. You talk about the things you do on the internet, right? Like, oh, you're using this app to read this thing, or you're searching using this engine, or whatever it is, right? Blockchain is going to become invisible, hopefully sooner rather than later. I personally would love to start talking about blockchain. It is going to be, I think, an indispensable part of a tech stack. It's not going to be the only thing you're running stuff on, but it's going to be a critical component of that. And I think we're seeing this technology moving away from fintech in digital public infrastructure as an option, right? When it comes to record keeping and things like that, we're seeing exploration of blockchain that still remains the case. There's questions around scaling of the technology, but these are all kind of earlier, middle stage, adolescent problems that are very similar to the growth of the internet. Yes. The difference, I think, is now everyone realized there was a tremendous amount of money to be made. You had a flood of people jumping into the space very quickly. And unlike the internet, blockchain kind of launched with an app on it, which was Bitcoin. You know what I mean? So the internet was kind of like connecting people. It was sort of like no one really knew. It was labyrinthine. It was kind of like for nerds only, for a long time, right? With this thing, you had Bitcoin, you had a use that kind of led the growth of the technology. And that was the first sort of thing. And so separating those things, I think, is interesting. But certainly it remains the case that the fintech space is really the area where we've seen actual, real, meaningful adoption and some of the most activity.
Well, thanks for classifying me as a nerd for having used the internet early. Though I
I'm
do
right
know
there with you, my friend. We have to be united. Oh, yes.
Your suggestion that blockchain will go away, I mean, we don't use the word cyberspace anymore, but that was the big hyped word back in those days.
Exactly.
So back to kind of the CBDC discussion. You talked a lot about the potential for countries to be investigating this. How about small countries like Bermuda? I mean, one of the big challenges we have, we're 60,000 people, 21 square miles. Are there risks in adopting this technology and saying we're just going to run forward and launch our own CBDC when most of our economy is externally focused, externally driven, and international business focused? How do we ensure that we're interoperable with other jurisdictions? How do we make sure that we're going to be where other jurisdictions go as they digitize their currencies?
Let me put it this way. Let me say a couple of things. First of all, when we started our central bank technologist group, I was insistent that we include smaller frontier and innovative economies. And in many cases, those three things all went together. What I was seeing was that the only exploration really being done at the time, now this has changed, by some of the big, giant, economies was very conservative. It was it was just really about making things that were already happening a little bit faster. It was very much an efficiency use case. Right. And that was important. And I thought I completely understood why that was the approach being taken by some of these, global economy determinant, countries. And I appreciated it to some extent. But, it really wasn't demonstrating the potential of the technology. And so I was very, very excited about some of the things that Bermuda was doing then and continues to do now. Other jurisdictions, Cambodia was really kind of ahead of the curve on this. There are a couple other places that I felt were really engaging experimentation that really, I think, was much more futurist in its orientation in terms of what it was going to turn into pretty quickly. And sure enough, what we're seeing now is that some of those experiments kind of proved the model in a way. They kind of showed that there was more to this than just kind of making existing settlement payments faster, which, again, not to sneeze at that, it is important and it will have an effect on the world economy, but it's not exactly, a gigantic game changer, in many ways. I also think it's really important to recognize that a lot of smaller economies have the ability to kind of ensure adoption in ways that are really, really tough in other kinds of more giant places with huge populations. So unless you're going to have a system where, like in India, they rolled out Aadhaar kind of overnight, or in China, they're going to kind of mandate some of this stuff from what we're hearing, you kind of get the opportunity to really see what happens and what that adoption curve can look like and what is interesting to people in terms of what their pain points are around some of this stuff, which I think is really exciting. But all of that aside, I think that some country is going to be the place that really cracks the nut on being regulatory friendly, but still providing enough stopgap and security around digital currency specifically. Someone's going to do that. And it's not going to be one of the gigantic major economies because they're being a lot more cautious. In my mind, it's almost kind of an up for grabs situation. So there is an opportunity here. It's not so much about jumping into the fray and being early adopters and all of that, which I think is really exciting, don't get me wrong, but it's about really laying the groundwork for doing that in a safe manner that the world can rely on. And a lot of the places I think that we're doing this very early on, we're really just about, bringing everyone to their jurisdiction just for to headquarter their company, whatever it might be, without thinking about providing that regulatory I'll say security almost, that a lot of banks and other institutions are going to want to see. So in my mind, the opportunity for that regulatory experimentation or kind of thinking that through with the business community and working those kind of details out is something that smaller economies are much better situated to do, and can pave the way for the world to follow.
In that context, are we really talking about a central bank issued money then, as opposed to trying to create an environment that allows for private sector entities to come in and experiment in a kind of small enclosed test space?
I think it's both, right? So we haven't really talked much about digital currency beyond CBDC, but let's kind of move there for a minute because there are two other classes, let's call them, of digital currencies that are also really exciting and we're seeing a lot of activity in. One is kind of pure crypto, so Bitcoin, Ethereum, like some of these things. But the other is a category called stablecoin. So it's not central bank issued, it's not fiat in that way, but it is fiat backed. So it's pegged, basically. It's still crypto in the sense that it's running on different rails and all of that, but it's connected to an economy, right? Connected to fiat in a way that's really important. So this is examples of this that people might be familiar with, right? The Libra token, USDC, US dollar coin is one, Tether is one. There's a couple of different ones, right? So they're basically pegged to this money, to this fiat money. And that's a place where I actually think we're seeing tremendous interest. Again, it's quieter interest. The way CBDC is now, kind of everyone's talking about it. Every central bank is pretty open about the fact they're looking. It's just not really it's a known thing. Like it's not perceived as being like crazy to be talking about central bank digital currency. Stablecoin is getting there. Like we are seeing more interest in that space. So that is where I actually think the regulation I was talking about, the regulatory environment, where it is friendly to safe experimentation, is something I think is really the world is kind of looking for and wants to kind of see what that could look like and what it could look like.
It's definitely an area we've been targeting. At last year's Tech Summit, we announced we would accept one-to-one bank deposit-backed digital currencies for payment of taxes, fees, and services, and we're progressing that along. A few weeks ago, or actually a couple months ago, we launched our pilot for stimulus coin, also bank deposit-backed, and we're very much looking at it and saying, well, if the technology is just an upgrade, then how is this different? I mean, how is it different from traditional bank money? Except that I think in this case, we have networks where we can share the implementation of money across banks, which is a considerable opportunity, kind of in the same way that Visa and MasterCard allow you to share the ability to make a payment across banks. Just at this level, you can do it really at holding accounts and then really open up a lot of the banking services that aren't really accessible today. So there is, I think, a lot of opportunities. Just how do you make yourself attractive? How do you seize it? And how do we craft the right risk management around it to make it a good place to be?
I think that's right. And the phenomenon of the Swiss bank, right? The kind of stereotypical Swiss banker and all of that, that was a very conscious development and movement by Switzerland and Swiss government to say we want to be attractive to banks. We want to kind of be the world's focus for some of this activity. And similarly, we haven't really landed on what that jurisdiction is in the digital space, in the digital currency space. But one of the reasons that so many banks, there's the Swiss bank phenomenon is like a thing, and it's kind of like a funny stereotype in a way, is because the regulation in Switzerland was really oriented towards that industry. And they were thinking a lot about what was going to make sense and how to have, almost ironically, some sort of centralization of the regulation for consistency purposes, right? And so the kind of buttoned up, secure, kind of model, there is a spin on that, or a take on that is going to apply to digital currency, where it's a different kind of safety mechanism that looks very different. It feels very different. It's about different things. Maybe it's about how you prosecute breach, or how you think about hacks, or whatever it might be, theft, like all this kind of stuff. Like there may be even things in there that you can go into, but I think there's an opportunity to be the Switzerland of the digital currency space, if you will. And certainly Switzerland has, there are quite some locations in Switzerland have really been looking at crypto quite a bit, crypto valley as they call it there. So why not somewhere else?
Well, Switzerland is doing a really great job. I think, as you say, it's locations in Switzerland. It's not necessarily Switzerland as a whole.
Right.
Zug is well known for being a leader in this space, but I think the challenge you get is you get a lot of experimentation happening in different areas, which is great. But it becomes hard to figure out where are you complying, where can you learn and advance at a fast pace. So we've put in a lot of effort in our regulatory framework in saying, well, we don't have complexities around taxes, and we don't have complexities around securities laws. So we were able to craft a bespoke framework that really gave a broad definition of digital asset. And I think it opens up a lot of opportunities that people aren't thinking of. But just looking at what the traditional person is thinking about, if I want to make an investment, and I tell this to people all the time, one of the biggest problems for the mainstream user is that I'm just as unlikely to invest in Bitcoin and Ethereum as I am to a local insurance company or a power company or a financial services firm, because it's really hard to understand those things. But I'm potentially very likely to make investments in local businesses that I actually peruse and use and understand. But where are the potential opportunities for those businesses, instead of saying they have to raise a lot of capital and go that complex route, to actually leverage the relationship they have with the client? And I think that's where we're starting to see that experimentation, saying, well, where's social money going to go?
Yeah.
How can I be paid in incentives and rewards that may be spendable within the local businesses, or exchangeable with those local businesses, that can help that business raise some capital, but also drive more people to their establishment? So as an example, I like to say, like, if a local bar was able to sell some debt or sell some equity, but then be able to reward people for holding it, not just in cash, but also a special coin that you could spend within the business. Or you might be able to go and rent out a booth, or you might be able to get discounts. It's something that, without a shared platform, that's a really complex and expensive thing to do. But I think with the digital currencies, what we're seeing is standardization that makes that possible. So it's not necessarily that everything's going to reform. It's just that if there's critical mass following certain standards, it becomes easy to say, okay, my point of sale system can accept that. So do I need specifically a global cryptocurrency powering my business? No. But if it's the same technology and it becomes easier for me to launch my pub coin, that's only spendable within the pub, but it doesn't cost me anything extra, it's really useful to be able to say I have access to that, to be able to engage my customers. And that's got nothing to do with cryptocurrencies and liquidity mining and all these other crazy buzzwords that you hear today, even though it is kind of liquidity mining for a small business, if we want to get technical.
Yeah, one thing that was really getting a lot of traction early on, that's gone a little quiet, but there's still experimentation happening, is just thinking about bonds and about bond raises, and how you actually could codify into a bond, issuance, this tokenization notion. You could actually have tokens that would let you vote on, if it's a bond on public schools, or on streets is a better one. Like if it's a bond on kind of like infrastructure, you could say, oh, we can fix one of these 5 potholes in this order, and you vote with your token, kind of thing, right? Like almost bringing this democracy into, or this process in an easy way that is actually manageable into some of this, of these issuances, which I think is really interesting when you think about the level of municipal level local control that a lot of people want to have, and the things that really constituents care about tremendously, which are their quality of life and their day-to-day experience. So there's things like this that these token models you're talking about can unlock, even beyond kind of the private enterprise business context, but thinking about what the government can actually do and how it can engage its citizens on an ongoing basis in voting with their tokens to kind of prove about the things or show the things that are really critical to be done with some of this. Now that has its pros and cons, and it has its detractors as well. But there's certainly a lot of technology can unlock that we have yet begin to explore.
There's so much opportunity. I think that's what people are sometimes missing. I had a great conversation a few days ago with Rutger from the Odyssey Hackathon in the Netherlands, and he was describing how there's opportunities to say, can you crowdsource awards for world-changing events? We're being able to say, like, we have a global challenge that we want to fund. Can we raise capital with that? And how can you actually provide the awards and the structuring from that instrument, where it's not really matching a lot of what we have today, but allows people to actually vote on and support the kind of change that we want to see in society on a more decentralized way. So lots of experimentation and lots of cool things that we're seeing.
Yeah, the forum is really backing this movement. Well, really kind of started this movement towards stakeholder capitalism. It's a concept that came up at Davos a couple of years ago, and the forum recently issued actually metrics that accounting firms and others can use to establish whether or not big corporations or others are really adhering to notions of stakeholder capitalism. That being the idea that rather than a corporate mandate just being to serve shareholders, there actually is this accommodation and realization that employees are stakeholders and customers are stakeholders, and there are a lot of, there are externalities that are stakeholders, the environment, whatever it might be. There are all these stakeholders. And one thing that tokens or blockchain or some of these different models can help do is, again, more equitably allocate risk and reward across the stakeholder set, rather than shoving all the risk onto some parties, in some cases the employees or others, and reserving all the reward for shareholders. You can more equitably distribute that in a way that that really benefits everyone. So I think this technology specifically can really help us just come to a new idea of what these models could look like, and not just business models, but what these kind of like equity models could look like, which I think is really exciting.
Yeah, it highlights actually one of my favorite concepts that I hope we see come forth is being able to actually create assets around our natural resources. When you look at the reef surrounding Bermuda, for example, if we estimate that eventually we're going to have carbon taxation globally, those kind of resources may end up having a lot of value in the future. And being able to invest in and source support for maintaining them and combating some of the challenges today can make them more valuable in the future. That it becomes that question of how can you make investments in world-changing things, and how can we actually unlock some natural assets that really aren't able to be tapped into today, and kind of create a market around them for the people who do care about these things, who do care about the long-term future and believe that that will be a much more valuable resource down the road, even though some people aren't valuing them enough today.
Exactly. And you can create a record of that, of the treatment of those resources that can kind of help you make comparisons across sectors or industries or geographies or whatever it might be, that can create, I think, important accountability in this space. Certainly when you talk to those involved in climate justice, one of the big issues is the accountability mechanism and how you actually kind of prove that some of these things are happening, and then remind people that, things went one way or another, and that the experiments have yielded certain kinds of results. Because we're talking about very long-term time horizons on some of the experiments to affect change. And having a mechanism for really demonstrating that over time, I think, could be very powerful.
How can this technology kind of help with the accountability aspect? I mean, how do we drive people to, or how do we log and know what has been done?
Well, one example that we experimented with was in Colombia, in Medellin. So we built an Ethereum-backed, basically, a system that was designed to focus on public procurement. And we were looking at reduction of corruption. So going specifically away from the environmental context to corruption is an example of how this record can be helpful. So what this system really did, or is designed to do, was to ensure that all the bids that were made for some of these opportunities, by various corporations, were all tracked, that the information was, it's required by law to be transparent, but there was a lot of kind of finagling, shall we call it, that was going on. So it created basically this record that was immutable. That's one of the attributes of blockchain, is that it is permanent from the standpoint of what you put on it is recorded. You can always, of course, indicate that a record was flawed and add a new record to correct, but the information that goes into it is held securely. And over time. So you were able to really see all the different groups that came in and put these bids down. And you could basically, where some of the corruption was happening was bids would get, lost, or they would get moved into a particular order, or the timestamp would be shifted, or whatever it was, right? None of that could actually happen. So you'd have a really accurate record of who came in when and how and who they engaged with, and all this stuff was seen. So the idea wasn't so much that you were eliminating the incentives for corruption, is that you were basically able to flag it. You could then create over time, the idea is you could actually create algorithms that could spot, irregularities and irregularities that couldn't be shifted by human engagement. You couldn't go in as a human and just alter the record. That's impossible on a blockchain. You just couldn't do that. And so some of that was deemed very important in terms of preserving the integrity of the public procurement process in Colombia, which of course, was definitely concerned about this, as many governments and countries around the world are. So it's an example of how the transparency component can actually lead to more accountability if the ledger is actually used appropriately, and there are policies around the ledger that make sure that the right information is accessible to the right people, et cetera. Just go a little bit further into that, one of the aspects of a blockchain that people really love is that it's transparent. And what I always say in response to that is, okay, well, what is transparent to whom? Like, transparency alone is not the end game. I'm a lawyer, right? So you would get sure, things are transparent with opposing counsel. They give you 1,000 boxes of documents. That's all transparent, but it's not actionable or useful, right? So what is transparent to whom is a policy question. And when you think about that and what you could record in a ledger and we make public to the media or to watchdog organizations or to other governments or whatever it is, you can really see how you could reduce things like corruption, but also enhance accountability by making the information available.
Now, you mentioned that actually happened on the Ethereum blockchain, which is more of a public ledger. Is that really because a blockchain plays a role where if multiple parties don't trust each other, it can kind of be that intermediary of trust, where it's a shared system that no one has control of? Was that something that was valuable in this specific case, or do you think a government-hosted system would have worked, or a permission system would have worked? What led to the decision to use an open public chain over other options?
Yeah, so the idea here was that the government wanted to prove and have a record to demonstrate that, honestly, was there going to be a shift? Would things have been done differently in the system the government was hosting, which of course existed, versus a system where there was more public, availability of the information? So some of this isn't so much that it's a proof issue, but I think to your point, yes, in one of the core use cases of a blockchain, or determinants of whether or not a blockchain can be helpful, is if there is no pre-existing trust relationship between parties or among parties. And so to go back to the earlier example of our payment app, where you and I get together and I'm like, oh, it's Dennis, I don't have to trust you because I trust my bank and your bank and, PayPal or Venmo or Square or whatever the thing is in the middle. And I'm like, I'm confident that they're going to have the right records and I don't have to really pay attention to this. But imagine if that didn't exist, you didn't have access to that, or for whatever, a million different reasons, right? What's to stop you, right, from basically, I give you $20 or whatever, and you're like, well, you never paid me, that never happened. You know what I mean? Like, in a situation like that, you can imagine where having some substitution for the trust is really important. And if you couldn't have access to these FIs or intermediary payment apps, and even if you could, you'd want to have some substitute for that. And that is what a blockchain-backed system can provide. It is a record basically of N computers recording that we exchange something at a moment in time. And in order to erase that or to change it, you would have to convince 50% plus one of those computers to change their record. And that's basically impossible in a public system because the computers don't know each other. There's tons of them, to kind of get not too technical on it, but that's sort of what it is. It's creating a new trust mechanism. And this leads to, I think, directly into why Web 3.0 is getting so, the web of trust concept is something that blockchain is kind of considered to be a key component of. this idea you can create this web of trust, and you can kind of use things like distributed decentralized technologies to help support the creation of such a mechanism that could, again, it could substitute for some of these intermediaries.
Yeah, it's a great topic to highlight. I think many people don't necessarily understand what a web of trust is. I try and distill it down by saying, if you imagine the introduction of the World Wide Web, which we talked about at the beginning of this talk, we introduced the hyperlink. If you use the lookup systems like Gopher before the World Wide Web, then you know how influential that was in allowing us to crawl the world's data. But we have no reliability on what's behind that hyperlink. We don't know what's there. We don't know if what its state was at a previous point in time. We don't know if it's accurate today. And so it's really challenging to be able to base global decisions upon that. So where I think we're seeing a lot of growth and interest is being able to recognize that blockchain can provide a means of saying, I can take a signature of what's behind that link and make it accessible. And I can show over time what it was. And I can basically point back to 3 years ago on this day, this is what the state of that data was, and be able to make that verifiable. And that really drives global trust. And I think we've seen that where you talked about, if I'm paying $20 to someone on the other side of the planet, it's about having that global trust of knowing that I'm dealing with someone that has a background that I can readily verify, that it is a shop that I recognize, as opposed to there's just some domain name that I'm kind of looking and guessing, will I actually get the product? Will it actually ship? And looking at how does that change things? Like, one of the big questions I face is, well, should we put like the land title registry on the blockchain? I think that was a big buzzy thing. And I think one of the challenges I faced was, it doesn't make any sense for a country like Bermuda in isolation. Because a land title, there's no real big issue of public trust if it's a government system and you can digitize land titles. But it becomes very interesting when you can say, well, what's the tax mechanism that you tie to that? What's, like, we have property taxes. So you've got the government auditing and validating what they think properties are worth. Once you connect that data, who owns it with what's the approximate value, and surface that to the globe, you suddenly got a valuable piece of information that other people can rely upon. And you've got an opportunity to take something like our 7% mortgage rates in Bermuda and say, there's a lot of people around the planet that would like to offer us lower rates, who are struggling with negative interest rates. I think there's just tremendous opportunity overall as we try and look at what is Web3 and what can it do.
I think that's exactly right. And I think one of the early, I wouldn't say mistakes, because people are still learning a lot, was this notion that blockchain was just a database. That was for, to store stuff on it, whatever. And it just missed the point. And so what I appreciated about, again, Bermuda and some of these other, innovative economies I was talking about, most of which were smaller economies, was pushing past that to say, we're just going to throw, our investment dollars into this technology for its own sake. It has to have a point. What is the point of it? And what are we going to do with this record, once we have it? And that's what you just said is a great example of thinking about, what could this unlock? What could it, how could it provide the security and the trust that would enable us to attract people from who knows where, to kind of think about potential engagement with our economy. And so one of the things that I've been saying for a while is that I really do think that a couple of things need to happen for a country's citizens to be full participants of the global digital economy. And one is digital identity. That's really, really important. So thinking about a digital identity scheme, we think a lot about it with the forum. We think about it in a global way. We think about it, we think that's really important. We think about, again, this multi-stakeholder global way, but certainly every jurisdiction should be thinking a lot about this. And I know that you all are. And the other thing I think is really making sure that you have readiness, that you're really thinking about the government tech stack, the digital infrastructure, public infrastructure, and how you could actually embed elements of some of these new technologies within your tech stack, so that you can be eating your own dog food, as it were, right? And you can kind of be ensuring that what you're doing really is providing an on-ramp for your citizens, whether that's into the economy, the global economy, or whether that's into the data economy, which is another big, big thing that a blockchain can help with in certain cases.
Yeah, on the digital identity front, I think it raises the same challenges that we have with the CBDC front, is that with 60,000 people, do we create our own siloed system when a large portion, 20 to 30% of our population is transient guest workers? We're a very multinational country dealing with international business all around the globe. How do we mitigate the fact that there's national systems, but there's also private systems? How do we manage that and make sure that we're interoperable with what's coming in the future? I think that's one of the challenges that I face and deal with all the time. Sure, we could launch a national system, but if you have to come in on board into it and no Bermudian can go anywhere else, like we travel off island for our healthcare, if our health records could be on chain or could be linked to a digital identity, but aren't portable to another jurisdiction, what value is there?
And I think that's exactly the right question, right? So that's why I think these are global problems. I think these are global questions. And I do think that what we're trying to do very much at the forum is ensure global thinking around them, because I actually think that having the sort of many flowers bloom, thing works in some contexts, but in others, as you say, it is going to be somewhat limiting. And so part of what I think it's about thinking about in terms of readiness is being poised to take advantage of some of those things, being educated about what's happening, having friendly regulation that makes sense for your particular citizenry and your particular use case, and really knowing what those things are. And so that's the encouragement that we give a lot of governments, is to say, it's going to be custom and specific to your jurisdiction, to your context, to your citizens, to your needs. But knowing what things are attractive and what things are interesting and not is going to give you the ability to very quickly engage with some of these things that may come out of other jurisdictions or other places, but you're not going to be lagging behind and further increasing some of the divide issues that we've seen in other contexts in other parts of the world around technology. So for us, it's a lot of it is about digital public infrastructure. It's about thinking about connectivity, things and things like this within everyone's jurisdiction, so that when the time really comes to accelerate, it's not going to be this, the leapfrogging is going to be a little less dramatic, than it might be if those preparations are not made.
Well, thank you very much, Sheila. I greatly appreciate you coming on today and joining us for our Tech Summit. We're also very appreciative to have the opportunity to be involved in the World Economic Forum's blockchain efforts. And I know the Premier very much appreciates the opportunity to have a voice and contribute our small perspective, but hopefully large impact on the global direction. So thank you again, and hopefully we can get you to come to the island. Of course, our borders are open and we are managing COVID quite well. So we would love to see you here. And we also have our remote work permit scheme, should you want to come and work here remotely for a little while.
It is a hot topic in my household, believe me. So thank you for that invitation and for the opportunity to speak with you today.